I'd like to now welcome the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce President and CEO, Richard Bettis.
Thank you, staff, and welcome everyone to our virtual town hall meeting with U.S. Senator Ted Cruz. I particularly want to thank our chairman of the board, Adam Hamilton, for joining us, as well as all of the business people from San Antonio and the surrounding region. Senator, just so you know, we have well over 250 people on this call today, so I'm very, very excited and proud. My introduction is that Senator Cruz was elected to represent the state of Texas in 2012. He currently serves on several key committees which impact businesses, including the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, the Committee on the Judiciary, the Joint Economic Committee, the Committee on Rules and Administration, and the Committee on Foreign Relations. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Senator Cruz has worked diligently with his fellow lawmakers to ensure as many people as possible stay employed, and the financial relief made available is accessible to all businesses throughout the economy. In preparation for the development of the next stimulus package, Senator Cruz has asked to hear from our business members about the resources and help needed to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and prepare for recovery. Senator, we appreciate you being with us today. You have the floor.
Well, Richard, thank you very much. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in this conversation this afternoon. Normally I wish I could be there in person. Typically in a time of crisis, it is much better to be together in person, visiting with people who are bearing the brunts of the crisis we're facing. But obviously with the global health pandemic we have, meeting face-to-face in a large group is not feasible or advisable. And so with the joys of technology, we can do this virtually through video conference. And I'm in the midst of a statewide teletour, meeting and listening to business leaders, local leaders, community leaders in every region of the state. And so I appreciate y'all taking the time to be part of this conversation. These are extraordinary times, to put it mildly. We have in the state of Texas 3 concurrent crises that we're dealing with. We're dealing with, number one, a public health crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, the consequences of which have been enormous. And we have taken remarkable, extraordinary steps to flatten the curve and slow the spread of that virus. We're dealing with, at the same time, number 2, an economic crisis. As we've got over 17 million people who've lost their jobs just in the last 3 weeks. We have millions of small businesses that are threatened with bankruptcies. We have entire sectors of our economy that have been decimated. And that economic crisis is the direct consequence of government policies that have been implemented to stop the global pandemic. And then third, a crisis in Texas in particular that we're dealing with is an energy crisis, which is in the midst of this global pandemic. Saudi Arabia and Russia took advantage of the crisis to flood the global market with oil, drive the prices down to less than half of what they were in an effort to bankrupt Texas energy producers. And that has the potential to threaten millions of jobs across the state of Texas. I can tell you those 3 crises are enormous, and they are consuming virtually every waking moment of my days, working to implement serious federal policy responses to each of them. I expect those responses to be much of what we discussed today, but since the purpose of this is really for me to hear from you, to hear your concerns, to hear your challenges, and to talk about how we overcome those challenges together, let me open it up to questions from the group.
Senator, thank you for that. We appreciate the fact that you're on the tour. I think you're right on with the 3 crises that we're facing. They're very serious, and we appreciate your leadership. So we've had a whole bunch of questions that folks have submitted, and I will begin. What would you like to see in stimulus package number 4 that's being discussed concurrently in both houses of Congress? Will it be limited to helping businesses recover, or will there be funding opportunities for other things such as infrastructure?
Well, let me back up. Before addressing number 4, let me talk about what number 3 did, and then I'll use that to go into number 4. Number 3, the CARES Act we passed 3 weeks ago, was a $2 trillion emergency relief bill, $2.2 trillion to be precise. It passed with overwhelming bipartisan agreement. It passed in the Senate unanimously. The vote was 96-0. That meant every Republican voted yes, every Democrat voted yes. I voted yes, and Bernie Sanders voted yes. that shows a pretty remarkable diversity of views. In any ordinary time, a $2 trillion bill would never have passed Congress. That's 10% of our national debt. But these are not ordinary times. These are extraordinary challenges. There are a number of elements of that bill that were very, very important. One of the elements is individual relief. Every American making $100,000 or less is getting a direct check from the government. $1,200 per adult, $500 per child. That means that a couple with 3 kids that is earning $150,000 or less will receive a check for $3,900. Those direct deposits should be made this week. About 80 million Americans will get those deposits this week, and the remainder of the checks should be arriving hopefully as soon as next week. That's designed to be immediate, real relief for people who are hurting, people who may have lost their job, people who may be scared about how am I going to make the rent payment next week, how am I going to put food on the table right now. That's meant to be immediate relief for Americans who are hurting. Another very important component of the CARES Act was the Paycheck Protection Program, the small business component. $350 billion in guaranteed loans, low-interest loans going to small businesses and directed to keeping people employed. Those small businesses are defined as 500 employees or fewer, and the program, as you know, is administered by community banks, local banks, and if the proceeds are used to pay salaries, to pay paychecks, to pay rent or mortgage for businesses, or to pay utilities, that amount of the proceeds are forgivable. That program is proving enormously popular. In fact, the #1 state in the country for receiving those PPP loans is the state of Texas. And that program is designed to keep as many people as possible in their jobs. Importantly, it applies even if the employees have been laid off or furloughed. If you're a small business who had to lay off or furlough employees in recent weeks because of the crisis, you can hire those employees back, and their salary should be covered by the forgivable amount of these proceeds. That's designed to keep as many Texans, as many Americans in a job, in the relationship with their employer, with their private health insurance they're getting through their job, and with a paycheck coming. And it also is designed to keep that small business alive so that we can move into the next stage. Now, the question was, what's coming next? And I would say there's a 3.5 and there's a 4. 3.5, I think, is likely to be just supplementing the small business, the Paycheck Protection Program. That is running out of money as soon as today or tomorrow because there's been enormous uptake and enormous enthusiasm. Last week, Senate Republicans tried to pass a supplemental bill adding $250 billion to the Paycheck Protection Program. Unfortunately, Democrats blocked it, and they're trying right now to hold the Paycheck Protection Program hostage for other unrelated policy objectives and partisan objectives. My hope is that they will stop hostage taking on this. The Democrats don't oppose the program. In fact, they're enthusiastically telling their constituents they support it. And so I have a significant degree of optimism that in the coming days, we will replenish that fund because the relief to small businesses is absolutely critical. So then the question is, what's next after that, once we replenish the small business fund? Well, I think it is likely the next legislation after that will wait at least several weeks, wait at a minimum to the end of the month or sometime in the first half of May. And the reason is, you know, this bill has spent $2.2 trillion. That's a massive amount of money. Much of that money still hasn't reached the intended recipients yet. It's in the process of being received right now. And so, look, for a lot of us who care deeply about deficits and debt and not bankrupting our kids and grandkids, spending $2 trillion is an extraordinary step. And I think we need to pause and see, okay, what effect does that money have? How is it being spent? Where is the need? And my hope is, listen, my view is we need to get Texans back to work. I talked about 2 crises, the public health crisis and the economic crisis. The economic crisis is very real. Those who are vulnerable, the very elderly, those with serious health conditions, they should remain quarantined. They should remain isolated. But those who are young and healthy, we need to get them back to work driving the economy. So my hope in terms of the next bill is that it's not a relief bill like this last one was, but rather it is a recovery bill, that we will be in a situation in early May, I hope, where small businesses are opening up, the economy is moving. I'm very glad that the president is laying out a plan to reopen the economy, that the governor is laying out a plan to reopen the Texas economy. That needs to happen, in which case the next bill, I think, should focus on tax reform and regulatory reform, lifting burdens on small businesses. As small businesses are opening their doors for business again, we want those businesses to survive and to thrive and drive economic growth moving forward. Part of the question was, will infrastructure be a part of it? It might. I certainly support an infrastructure bill. It will depend on the extent to which House Democrats are engaged in partisan hostage taking. It is possible we'll see an infrastructure bill move forward, but it will depend on the details. What I think is critical, we got to get people back to work.
Excellent. Well, I think very much along the line, several of the questions are talking about the fact that the PPP is basically finished already, that it's all been used up. So I think your point about the $250 billion, the 3.5, if you will, stimulus 3.5 is right on. So needing to be able to get that money out quickly. One of the challenges that some of our small businesses are having, though, Senator, is SBA and the ability to get those things through SBA. Are there any focuses that you all are doing on SBA to provide them with additional assistance to get that money out quickly?
So we certainly are, Richard, but it's worth pausing to focus on the magnitude of what's happening. $2.2 trillion is a massive amount of money. If you look at the SBA's budget this year was $23 billion. We just appropriated $350 billion to flow through it. That is 15x greater than anything they've done before. It is a massive amount. And look, we had a 900-page bill that was drafted and passed in a week. There are going to be bumps. There are going to be bureaucratic red tapes and delays. There's going to be unintended consequences. That is inevitable. I can tell you my office is working very, very closely with local leaders, with business leaders in Texas to try to work through those bumps and those challenges and those delays. So listen, SBA is drinking from a fire hose. Local banks and financial institutions are drinking from a fire hose. And so there have been some frustrating delays. That being said, everyone is trying to expedite matters, and my office is working to get those dollars deployed as fast as humanly possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator. Next question. There is a good bit of concern on the safety of our healthcare workforce. Doctors, nurses, technicians, caregivers, first responders. Will the next coronavirus bill, 4.0, 3.5, include any hazard pay or the like for those kind of frontline workers?
So part of the CARES Act was $100 billion directed to hospitals and healthcare facilities. Another component of the CARES Act was $150 billion for state and local governments. Both of those sums of money are just going out now. They're just starting to be received now. So it will take some time for those to be deployed and implemented. There's also funding in the CARES Act for deployment of testing, for deployment of PPE, of protective equipment. I think that remains critical. When it comes to defeating the pandemic, I've focused on 4 priorities. Number 1, testing, making it more readily available and more accurate. Number 2, PPE, making sure especially frontline, first responders, healthcare workers have masks and gloves and the protective equipment they need. Number 3, critical medical equipment, things like ICU beds and ventilators. I've been working very, very closely with the governor to make sure that we're deploying those assets where they're needed in Texas to be prepared for any surge we might see. And number 4 is streamlining and accelerating the federal regulatory process. The FDA, and I've introduced legislation to streamline the process to develop more quickly, to approve and develop vaccines and treatment and ultimately a cure for COVID-19. And so I think in terms of solving the problem, we need to focus on all 4.
Excellent, Senator. Thank you. Another question, 501c6s. 501c6s were not included in the original stimulus. What are your thoughts on the inclusion of 501c6 trade organizations and the like?
So it's a great question. I think we should. They weren't explicitly included. I can tell you, as I'm doing this teletour across the state, I've been meeting with chambers of commerce in East Texas and West Texas and South Texas. I've been meeting with Hispanic chambers of commerce. Virtually every one of these teleconferences I've had, the question of C6 has come up because the work y'all do is critical in terms of empowering small businesses, in terms of informing small businesses, giving them the tools that we needed to drive this economic reform. I think the issue is unlikely to be fixed on the legislative side, just because I think what we will probably see is a clean replenishment of the small business portion. You look at the bill Republican leadership filed, it's a two-page bill. It simply changes the number 350 to 600 billion, so it adds 250. But the good news is that I think this can likely be fixed through the administrative and regulatory side. And I've been very, very active working with the Treasury Department, the Small Business Administration, trying to correct all of the bumps in the road we've had. So, for example, one issue that I was very involved with, along with several other senators, was the issue of churches and faith-based organizations and whether they qualified for the PPP. It was unclear initially whether they would be allowed to qualify or not. I engaged vigorously, and thankfully the administration put out guidance several days ago, making clear that they could participate on the same neutral terms as everybody else, so they wouldn't be discriminated against because they're faith-based. I think that was the right solution, but it took the administration making that clear. On the question of C6s and chambers of commerce, I think that's important, and as it so happens, I've got a phone call scheduled with Steven Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, in a little bit over an hour this afternoon, and this is one of the issues I'm going to bring up with him directly this afternoon. We'll see if we can get movement on it, but I hope that we can.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator. Another question. Do we see any potential for investments in workforce development programs like apprenticeships and internships during this next stimulus?
Listen, I think it's a terrific question. I am a huge proponent of workforce development. I'm a huge proponent of apprenticeships. One of the things, Richard, you know, because we've talked about before, I introduced legislation that would have provided federal tax credits for contributions to scholarship granting organizations, both on K through 12 education, but also in workforce development, apprenticeships and adult training to develop critical skills. The legislation I introduced was $10 billion a year in federal tax credits, matching tax credits, so $100 billion over the course of 10 years. I think it's hugely important. And when, you know, I talked about how the next legislation should be hopefully not relief legislation as much as it is recovery legislation, focused on how do we move forward and recover. I'd love to see tax credits for apprenticeships included in the mix, and I'm pressing forward ideas that would get people working and get the economy driving again, and I think that's certainly one of the ones that Congress should consider.
Excellent, Senator. Thank you. Another question. Regarding support for hourly wage workers, how is messaging getting to individuals and small businesses that the opportunities exist for them?
Well, you know, look, for a lot of workers, when we have 17 million people unemployed in 3 weeks, that's 10% of the workforce in the entire country. For an awful lot of folks, particularly if you're working in a restaurant, you're working in a bar, you're working in a movie theater, you're working in a bowling alley, you're working in a nail salon or a barber shop. You know, so many of those businesses have been effectively shut down. Hotels have been decimated. Airlines, the workers are still employed, but the airline industry, you get on a plane, the planes are empty. You go to hotels are facing, 5-6% occupancy rate. The way Congress has tried to approach it is give emergency relief, the individual relief and the small business relief. But at the same time, to fix this problem, we've got to get people back to work. There's no amount of government policy that can make the business model for a hotel magically work with no customers. Like business does not work without any customers. And as we're thinking through this issue, initially the focus, quite rightly, was on flattening the curve and stopping this pandemic. But as we've seen this play out, we have to recognize that there are real harms on both sides of the ledger, on the economic side as well. And in fact, there are real public health harms. As you look at millions of people unemployed, millions of small businesses risking going bankrupt, people's savings being destroyed, people's businesses that they've devoted a lifetime to building going up in smoke. If that continues, we know there are going to be real public health harms that come from that. We know that there are going to be mental health issues. There's going to be depression. We know that there's going to be an increased risk of suicide, increased substance abuse and alcohol use. All of that is going to cost lives. And I think we need to be looking at both sides of the ledger. The objective needs to be to protect life and to minimize the loss of lives. What does that mean? That means that and it's going to vary geographically, by the way. I mean, different geographic regions are facing different problems. And so, for example, New York City, the public health situation in New York City is horrific, what they're going through right now. Nobody in their right mind would suggest that New Yorkers should go back to work tomorrow. But there are other parts of the country, there are parts of Texas where the situation is not nearly as severe, where we can make determinations, okay, really vulnerable populations, the very elderly, those with serious health problems, you should stay isolated and protected because this virus it has particularly high lethality rates for those vulnerable populations. But for young, healthy people, we need to get you back to work. We need to get you back driving the economy. Now, it doesn't mean magically things will go back to where they were 3 months ago. We may well. So, for example, I'm working at home. I've been working at home for over a month. Heidi's working here at home. Our girls are going to school, doing distance learning on the computer, 3rd grade and 6th grade. We're all in one house. It's America. We haven't killed each other yet. But you know, one of the things we're doing is a lot of evenings for dinner, we're ordering food delivered, trying to support small businesses and restaurants in the area. And every night the delivery guy who comes typically comes out with a mask and gloves to drop it off on the doorstep. It may well be as we start shifting people back to work that people will be wearing PPE in certain circumstances where it makes sense. It may well be in restaurants that they have to reconfigure the dining room to separate the tables more so there's social distancing. And so we mitigate the chance of spread, but at the same time, let people get back to work. And I think that's going to be critical. I think Texans are ready to drive the economy forward and to protect life on both sides of the ledger.
Well said, Senator. And I'll tell you, your situation, you and Heidi working from home, your girls, I've got several members of my team doing the exact same thing, and it is an adjustment, but they're making it. They're making it, and it's working, thank goodness. So another question.
You'll appreciate the other night I was doing Laura Ingraham on Fox News, and I was at the computer doing an interview, and my girls came up, and they didn't quite, but they almost took our cat and put it on my head in the middle of the TV interview, which would have been an interesting moment.
For sure. TV to watch, huh? So another question. Governors have stated they need $500 billion to repair the catastrophic economic damage. Do you support their request, and how quickly do you see the federal government getting states monies that they need to get the economy moving?
So there's a balance on this. If you look at the CARES Act, initially it was negotiated in the Senate. It was negotiated in a bipartisan process where Democrats and Republicans both participated in the negotiations, participated in the drafting, and we had widespread agreement. And then if you'll remember, at the last minute, Nancy Pelosi parachuted in and blew the whole thing up. And she had a whole series of partisan demands, most of which were unrelated to the coronavirus crisis. So for example, lots of elements of the Green New Deal, she was trying to use this crisis as a vehicle to mandate. So she had strict emission standards on airplanes. I gave a speech on the Senate floor asking what in the hell do emission standards for airplanes have to do with coronavirus crisis? We need to stay focused on the problem. Now, thankfully, most of those partisan objectives, the Democrats receded from, and we ended up going back to the bipartisan bill that had buy-in from both parties. That's by and large what passed. The main ask of congressional Democrats ended up being funding for state and local governments. That was the biggest thing they were leaning in on. And the final bill we passed, I mentioned earlier, had $100 billion for hospitals and healthcare providers and an additional $150 billion for state and local governments. And that was those were the main asks from the Democrats that we agreed to. Right now, for replenishing the small business funds, Democrats are demanding yet more money for state and local governments. And I'll tell you what the hesitancy is. Number one, we haven't spent the $250 billion that we allocated already. And so it's my view, I think the view of a number of Republicans, we have to spend that money first. The small business funds have been spent. That fund is expected to be empty either today or tomorrow. But we haven't spent the other funds, and so we shouldn't be appropriating more money until we see how the first money is spent. But secondly, there's a dynamic that there's real hesitancy. Look, if you look nationally, there are a number of states that have not been fiscally responsible and prudent with how they've spent their resources, and they've dug themselves into a hole with massive pension obligations beyond their ability to pay. I think one of the reasons the Democrats are pushing so hard for funds for state and local governments is they're looking for bailouts for these states that have created the problems. And I got to tell you, as a senator charged with representing 29 million Texans, Texas has been fiscally responsible. We've lived within our means. And I don't want Texas taxpayers to have to pay for a massive bailout of states like Illinois and California. That I don't think that's right or fair to penalize Texas small businesses, Texas taxpayers, because other states didn't live within their means. And so that has been a nub of contention. I think it will continue to be a nub of contention because it remains the top ask of the Democrats, and it has a potential of really harming taxpayers in a state like Texas who have been fiscally responsible and I expect to continue to be. So I think the best solution, rather than a massive bailout for every state and local government, is to focus on policies that will enable small businesses to reopen, to be driving jobs forward, to be driving economic growth. And that will benefit state and local governments because, look, the dynamic we're seeing right now is state and local governments have seen their tax revenues plummet because people aren't working. Well, let's get them back to work, and the tax revenues will go up commensurately.
Well said, Senator. So I've got another question here. There are serious and ongoing discussions about reopening the economy. Do you support the idea of every state organizing an economic recovery task force or one national economic recovery task force? What do you think?
Oh, I think we'll see both. So the president is organizing national task force. I think that makes perfect sense to talk about nationally what can we do, particularly for federal policies that would impact the nation as a whole. I think that's beneficial to get input from business leaders. But each state is going to have a different circumstance, and so I fully expect to see governors pull together task forces looking at the issues unique to each state, and that's part of the beauty of our federalist system, is that it allows that diversity state by state, but also that diversity regionally. Look, the Rio Grande Valley faces different issues than Houston, Texas, where I live. Dallas has different issues than the Panhandle, and so we need to reflect that diversity. San Antonio is different from Corpus, and all of that. The challenges, the policies that would impact each community. I think we ought to listen to the input from members of that community.
Thank you, Senator. So we're still getting several other questions about just the slowness of SBA. Yep. I thought you did a great job of just reflecting on SBA's budget and how small it is compared to what you've given them. Can you touch on that one more time? Because I think we've probably had folks that have come in at the last minute here or come in late.
Sure. Look, there has been significant frustration with the speed of the Paycheck Protection loans. And I understand that frustration. I've spoken with bankers. I've spoken with business leaders. It's worth reflecting the volume of what's going through there. It is an increase of 15x over their budget. It went from $23 billion to $350 billion. And so they're overwhelmed. Every federal agency is overwhelmed trying to move $2.2 trillion through it. They're not designed for this volume. The local banks are not used to this volume of interest. And in fact, if you look at the numbers that came out last night of the PPP, the number one state in the country for the Paycheck Protection loans is the state of Texas. And we've got about $22 billion in Paycheck Protection loans have gone out in the state of Texas. That's more than any state, more than California, more than New York. And so it's impacting a lot of folks. But my office is working to try to make the process more efficient. We're working very closely with Treasury. We're working very closely with SBA. But inherent in any large government bureaucracy, there's going to be some bureaucratic slowdown and red tape. We're trying to streamline that as much as possible.
Excellent, Senator. Thank you. And why don't we close with this? I know time is getting short. The question is, you mentioned all the health and mental health issues that will arise as a result of the pandemic. What are the plans for ensuring Americans have access to quality health care to address both mental and physical health going forward?
Look, I think it's a hugely important priority. And when it comes to access to health care, that is a big priority for me. I think in terms of what's actually effective in giving people quality health care, it is private health insurance through their jobs. That's the reason why we focus so vigorously on the Paycheck Protection Program and keeping people employed, because when people leave their private health insurance, when they move to, for example, Medicaid, shifting to Medicaid, the health outcomes get much, much worse. You end up with much worse mortality rates. You end up with fewer choices. You end up with a lot fewer doctors willing to participate. And so I want to see as many people as possible employed, and I want to see consumers having as much choice as possible. The way you get prices down is expanding consumer choice. So I've been a big advocate of what I call the Consumer Freedom Amendment that says that healthcare consumers should be able to purchase the health insurance they want without government restrictions taking choices away from them. That drives costs down. I can tell you legislation I've introduced on this question that I think is particularly important concerns health savings accounts. Health savings accounts let you save in a tax-advantaged way for your healthcare needs. Right now, health savings accounts are restricted only for those people with a high deductible plan. So most Americans can't have a health savings account. I've introduced legislation to say we should let everyone create a health savings account, that would expand consumer freedom, expand healthcare options, enable people to save their money in a tax-advantaged way to meet healthcare needs. I would love to see something like that legislation included in recovery legislation, because that would be a significant reform in terms of driving down costs and expanding choice.
Excellent. I think you are definitely right with that. How about one final one? And I think you touched upon this one, but I think it's really good. As I realize that the stimulus bills are viewed as necessary and needed right now, how do we avoid the downside of the long-term debt and deficits associated with this extraordinary spending for our community?
Look, it is an enormously consequential question. It's one that weighs on me heavily. Our debt, and it's part of the reason why, having spent $2.2 trillion, I think we need to slow down a little bit and see what happens, because we're borrowing this money. It's not like the federal government has some vault that they're pulling it out of. We're just borrowing it against our kids and grandkids. Now in this time of crisis, I think it has been enough of an emergency to justify that borrowing, to say, look, we need to give small businesses, individuals, short-term bridge loans. We don't want to see a liquidity crisis become a solvency crisis. We don't want to see businesses. You don't want to see every hotel owner in America forced to sell their hotel on the marketplace and get 10 cents on the dollar simply because they have no customers. And critically, this is through no fault of their own. This is very different from the financial crisis in 2008, where many of the financial firms, their own conduct helped cause the crisis. In this instance, the restaurants, the bars, all the small businesses, they didn't do anything to create this pandemic. This is not their fault. And we don't want to see these businesses obliterated as a consequence. And so the short-term bridge loan keeps them viable long enough to come back. But if we continue freezing the economy for weeks and months on end, I think the damage and the debt that will come out of it will be extraordinarily difficult to recover from. It's part of why I think we need to shift to getting people back to work, because the best solution is to have the economy roaring and creating economic growth. We had 3 months ago, we had the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We had the lowest Hispanic unemployment ever recorded and the lowest African American unemployment ever recorded. We got to get back to that, and that's how we end up turning around the debt picture. If the economy isn't moving, the debt picture is unsolvable. If the economy is roaring again, that's how we tackle the debt.
Senator, as always, you're very direct and forward in your words. They're uplifting, they're right on point, and it's really what is exactly happening in D.C. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your staff, Javier Salinas, and of course, Carl Mitcha. They've done a great job in helping us put this together. We appreciate you being here. I know you've got to run, but thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I know Javi and Carl will send you the $20 for the kind shout out. And let me say to all of you just two things very briefly in closing. Number one, thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the leadership with your employees, with your families, with your communities. It makes a huge, huge difference. And number two, a word of encouragement. We're going to make it through this. Texans are strong and resilient. Americans are strong and resilient. We've faced huge challenges before. We've faced 2 world wars. We've faced a Great Depression. We faced 9/11. We've faced global health pandemics. And we'll come through by coming together, uniting, standing strong together. And I'm proud and honored to stand side by side with each of you as Texans as we overcome these crises today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, sir. Good talking to you.
You too.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, any questions that we were unable to get to, we will share them with the senator and his team, and then we'll get back to you once they get answered. One last time, remember that we're going to record this, and of course, we'll show it on our website. We've got a website that's called SAChamberRapidResponse.org. And then finally, I'd like to remind you that tomorrow, April the 16th at 10 a.m., we have a Log and Learn series that we're calling Balancing Working and Schooling from Home. You know, the senator talked about the fact that now they're doing having to teach their children from home. Many of us are doing that, but many of us, like myself and folks on my team, are just not quite prepared and are not feeling strong about our ability to do that. Tomorrow at 10, we've got Reve Schaefer with Region 20 who will give us a lot of good information and hopefully bolster us up in what we're doing and that we're doing it right. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll close by saying thank you. Be safe, be kind, be healthy, and from all of us here at the Chamber, thank you very much for joining us.